The winter of 1945 was one of the harshest Europe had ever seen. The forests of eastern France were silent, buried beneath a heavy blanket of snow. Smoke curled from shattered trees, and the air carried the bitter scent of gunpowder and frozen mud. In this grim landscape, near a small French village called Holtzwihr, a lone American soldier was about to carve his name into history, not through luck, but through impossible courage. His name was Audie Murphy, a young Texan barely in his 20s, small in stature but made of unbreakable resolve. What happened on that bitter January day would defy belief, shock the German troops who faced him, and echo through the annals of warfare as one of the most extraordinary acts of individual bravery ever recorded. By early 1945, the Allied push into German-held territory was relentless but costly. The 3rd Infantry Division, veterans of some of the toughest campaigns in Italy and France, was stretched thin. The enemy, though retreating, was desperate and dangerous, fighting for every inch of ground. On the morning of January 26, Murphy's company, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, was ordered to hold a small stretch of road near Holtzwihr. It seemed a simple defensive position, but the snow-covered woods hid more than just trees. Across the field, German forces, well-armed, well-trained, and supported by tanks, were preparing for a counterattack that would soon fall upon Murphy and his men with terrifying force. Audie Murphy had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice his age. He had been wounded, promoted, and decorated multiple times. Yet, despite all he had endured, he remained humble, almost quiet, a man who led by example rather than words. His comrades trusted him completely. That morning, as he surveyed the terrain through the mist and falling snow, Murphy sensed something was wrong. The silence was too deep. The forest too still. The kind of stillness that soldiers learn to fear. Then came the sound, distant engines, rumbling low like thunder from the belly of the earth. The Germans were coming. They came in waves, a force of roughly 250 enemy soldiers, supported by 6 tanks and armored vehicles, pushing through the woods with chilling precision. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and dangerously exposed. Within minutes, the first shells began to explode across the field. Trees splintered. Earth erupted. Men dove for cover as machine gun fire stitched the snow around them. Murphy ordered his men to hold the line, to stand their ground. He called for artillery support, his voice calm but urgent over the radio. The American guns responded, pounding the German formations, but it wasn't enough. The enemy kept advancing. Realizing the situation was hopeless, Murphy made a fateful decision. He ordered his men to fall back, to regroup deeper in the forest where they could mount a stronger defense. But he didn't move. Instead, he stayed behind. Alone. His position was a slight rise in the terrain, a muddy ditch near a burning American M10 tank destroyer that had been hit earlier in the fight. Its crew had abandoned it, the vehicle still smoldering, its .50 caliber machine gun mounted and loaded. Murphy crawled toward it, bullets snapping overhead, explosions shaking the ground. If he could just reach that gun, maybe he could buy his men a few more minutes. Maybe enough to survive. As his men disappeared into the woods behind him, Murphy climbed onto the burning wreck. Flames licked at his boots, smoke stung his eyes, but he opened fire. The .50 caliber machine gun roared to life, its thunder echoing across the frozen fields. German soldiers, thinking the American position had been abandoned, were caught in the open, and Murphy cut them down in devastating bursts. The weapon bucked against his shoulder, tracer rounds slicing through the snow, tearing into enemy ranks. The Germans were stunned. How could one man, a lone figure standing atop a flaming tank, unleash such fury? Some believed they faced an entire American platoon. Others thought it was a trap. But it was neither. It was just Murphy, fighting alone. For nearly an hour, he held his ground. Every time the Germans tried to flank him, he shifted his fire. When they sent infantry crawling through the ditches, he dropped grenades on them with deadly precision. Machine gun bursts tore through his jacket, shrapnel grazed his face, but he refused to yield. The heat from the burning tank scorched his hands, the recoil bruised his arms, and still he fired. His radio crackled, his commander begging him to pull back before he was overrun. But Murphy ignored the order. He knew that if the Germans broke through now, his men, the ones he had ordered to retreat, would be slaughtered. So he stayed. When the last belt of ammunition ran out, Murphy finally jumped from the tank, smoke curling from his uniform, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The snow around him was littered with shell casings and the bodies of enemy soldiers. And still, the Germans were regrouping. Undeterred, Murphy limped back to his men, gathered a rifle, and continued directing artillery fire on the enemy positions with calm precision. His voice over the radio was steady, almost mechanical, as he called in coordinates. Explosions erupted among the German tanks, breaking their momentum. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surviving German soldiers began to withdraw. The attack had been broken, by one man. The official after-action report would later confirm the impossible. Audie Murphy had single-handedly held off 250 German soldiers and 6 tanks for more than an hour, allowing his company to reorganize and counterattack. For this act of unimaginable valor, he would receive the Medal of Honor, the highest military award in the United States. But for Murphy, it was never about medals or glory. He once said, "I just tried to stay alive and keep my men alive." Yet his courage that day went far beyond survival, it embodied the very essence of sacrifice and duty. Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr became legend not just among Americans, but even among the Germans who had faced him. Prisoners later spoke of their disbelief, how they thought they were under attack by an entire force, not a single soldier. They could not comprehend how one man could wield such tenacity, such defiance in the face of certain death. But that was the nature of Audie Murphy, the boy from Texas who grew up hunting rabbits to feed his family, who lied about his age to join the army, and who transformed from a shy farm kid into one of the greatest warriors of the 20th century. What began as a desperate act of defense became one of the most astonishing stories of individual heroism in modern warfare. In that frozen French field, surrounded by fire, death, and chaos, a lone soldier proved that courage is not measured by the size of the army behind you, but by the strength of the heart within you. And in that hour of fire and snow, Audie Murphy stood alone, and the Germans who faced him would never forget the day a single American soldier defied an entire army. The story of Audie Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr doesn't begin in France, or even in the army. It begins in the dusty plains of Kingston, Texas, where a frail, underfed boy was born into poverty during the Great Depression. The Murphy family was large, 12 children, and times were cruel. The land was unforgiving, the crops often failed, and hunger was a familiar companion. From a young age, Audie learned what hardship meant, not from war, but from life itself. He hunted small game to feed his brothers and sisters, using an old .22 rifle that seemed almost as big as he was. Every shot mattered. Every missed rabbit meant someone went hungry. This early training, patience, precision, calm under pressure, would one day translate into the kind of battlefield composure that only the rarest soldiers possess. School was a luxury he couldn't afford for long. By 5th grade, Audie dropped out to work full-time in the cotton fields, earning a few cents a day to help his mother keep the family alive. His father, Emmett Murphy, drifted in and out of their lives, a man broken by failure and drink. That left young Audie as the man of the house before he was even a teenager. He was quiet, reserved, and shy, but there was a fierce fire inside him, a determination forged by hunger and responsibility. People who knew him back then remembered his piercing blue eyes, his polite manners, and the sadness that seemed to linger behind his smile. Life had hardened him early, but it had also given him something few men ever learn, how to endure. When his mother died in 1941, something inside Murphy broke. He was only 16. The woman who had been his strength, his reason to keep going, was gone. He was left alone with grief, guilt, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. The world outside was at war, and Murphy felt an irresistible pull toward it, not for adventure, but for purpose. He wanted to fight, to escape the weight of his own life, to prove that he could matter. But the army didn't want him. He was too small, too young, too thin. At 5 feet 5 inches and barely 110 pounds, he looked more like a farmhand than a fighter. The Marines turned him away. The paratroopers rejected him. Even the Navy said no. But Murphy was relentless. He altered his birth certificate to fake his age, and finally, in 1942, at just 17 years old, he was accepted into the U.S. Army. When Murphy was deployed overseas, first to North Africa and later to Italy, he entered the crucible that would forge him into legend. The Mediterranean campaigns were savage. Heat, disease, and exhaustion killed nearly as many men as bullets. Murphy was still just a teenager when he saw his first combat, and when he killed for the first time. He later said that the experience changed him forever. "There's nothing noble about war," he once wrote. "It's just destruction, cruelty, and death." But even in that chaos, he showed something extraordinary: control. While other soldiers panicked under artillery fire, Murphy seemed almost unnaturally calm. His commanders began to assign him more dangerous missions, and every time, he delivered. Through 1943 and 1944, he fought in Sicily, Anzio, and southern France, surviving some of the bloodiest fighting of the European theater. He was wounded multiple times, yet refused evacuation. His comrades saw him as quiet but fiercely protective, the kind of man who would take the point position on a patrol because he wouldn't ask another to do what he wouldn't do himself. In the foxholes at night, he spoke little, often sitting apart, cleaning his rifle, staring into the distance. Some thought he was detached, others sensed something deeper, a man haunted already by the ghosts of war. By the time the Allied armies crossed into France in mid-1944, Murphy had earned a reputation for impossible bravery. At Montélimar, he led a counterattack that destroyed several enemy positions. In another battle, he single-handedly captured a group of German soldiers using only his carbine and a few grenades. Word spread through the division: there was this kid from Texas who didn't know how to quit. His medals began to pile up: Silver Star, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross, but each decoration seemed to weigh heavier on him. The more he survived, the more he carried on his conscience. Many of his closest friends were gone, killed in ambushes or by shells that landed just feet away. He once said, "I feel like death follows me around." As the winter of 1945 approached, Murphy's unit was sent to the Colmar Pocket, one of the last German strongholds in eastern France. The fighting there was desperate. Hitler's forces were throwing everything they had left to hold the Rhine. For Murphy, this was the culmination of years of relentless combat, exhaustion etched into his face, a 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. Yet despite the fatigue, he had become the heart of his company. When officers were wounded or killed, Murphy stepped up, leading men twice his age with quiet authority. He didn't give speeches or shout commands. He simply led by example. In his presence, even the most terrified soldiers found courage. It was this unspoken bond, the loyalty of his men, that defined Murphy more than medals ever could. They would later say they followed him not because of his rank, but because they trusted him with their lives. And in the frozen woods of Holtzwihr, he would prove that trust beyond measure. His stand that day wasn't a sudden act of madness or adrenaline. It was the product of everything that had shaped him: the hunger of his youth, the loss of his mother, the discipline of a soldier who had seen too much death to flinch from his own. As the German offensive began, Murphy's instincts told him what was coming long before anyone else realized. He could sense the pressure in the air, the subtle rhythm of artillery fire shifting closer, the distant movement of armor. It was the same hunter's instinct he'd learned as a boy, the same patience that had kept his family fed. But this time, the prey and predator were reversed. He was the hunted, standing between an army and his men. When he climbed onto that burning tank destroyer, it wasn't a moment of cinematic bravado, it was calculation. He knew his company was exposed. He knew the Germans were advancing fast. That .50 caliber gun wasn't just a weapon, it was a wall of fire that could stall an entire assault. And Murphy, trained by life itself to endure pain and fear, made the decision instantly. He would hold the line, no matter what it cost. That's the essence of heroism, not fearlessness, but the ability to act despite fear. And so, everything that had defined his life converged in that single hour at Holtzwihr. The boy who once hunted rabbits now hunted tanks. The young man who once couldn't feed his family now protected an entire company. The orphan who had nothing left to lose became the shield that saved hundreds of lives. It wasn't fate. It wasn't luck. It was Audie Murphy, the product of struggle, discipline, and a will that refused to break. When the Medal of Honor was later pinned to his chest, Murphy didn't smile. He didn't give a speech. He simply said, "They were all brave men. I just got caught up in the action." That humility came from the same place as his courage, a deep, unshakable understanding that true heroism isn't loud, it's quiet. It doesn't seek glory. It simply does what must be done. In the years to come, historians would study his actions, psychologists would debate his composure, and soldiers would whisper his name in training camps around the world. But the truth is simple, Audie Murphy was not superhuman. He was a man who had lived through hardship, learned endurance, and found in himself the power to stand when no one else could. His courage was born of struggle, his discipline born of necessity, and his defiance born of love for his comrades, his duty, and the idea that some things are worth standing alone for. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, and the thunder of artillery faded into the soft echoes of peacetime, the world began to move forward. Cities rebuilt. Families reunited. Soldiers came home to parades, applause, and the promise of a new beginning. But for Audie Murphy, the war never really ended. His body came back to America, but his soul remained in the snow-covered fields of France. Behind the Medal of Honor, behind the glory, there was a quiet torment, the unseen cost of standing alone against 250 men. In June 1945, the Army's most decorated soldier returned to the United States. He was greeted with fanfare, reporters, and cameras flashing in his face. Politicians lined up to shake his hand. The newspapers called him the bravest soldier of them all. Hollywood stars sent letters. Generals saluted him. Yet through it all, Murphy looked distant, polite, humble, but detached. He didn't like the attention. He didn't like being called a hero. To him, the word hero belonged to the men who hadn't made it back. The ones still lying in unmarked graves across Europe. He had earned every major U.S. combat award for valor, including the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. But when interviewers asked him about his medals, he would shrug and say, "They don't mean much. There were many braver men than me." That was Audie Murphy, a man who saw himself not as a symbol, but as a survivor. Someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and couldn't quite understand why he was the one still breathing when so many others were gone. After the war, Murphy struggled to find his place in the world he had fought to protect. The battlefield had given him clarity, purpose, and identity. Civilian life offered only noise and confusion. Crowds made him anxious. Loud sounds made him flinch. Nightmares kept him awake for weeks. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then, there was no name for it, only battle fatigue. Murphy called it my bad dreams. He would wake up drenched in sweat, reliving the screams, the explosions, the smell of burning tanks. Sometimes he'd reach for a pistol in the dark, convinced he was still under attack. Friends tried to help. Some suggested he write about his experiences. And so he did. In 1949, his autobiography To Hell and Back was published, a brutally honest account of his life as a soldier. The book became a national bestseller. It wasn't glamorous or heroic. It was raw, unfiltered, and filled with pain. Murphy wrote of fear, loss, and the psychological wounds that medals couldn't heal. The American public saw a new side of their war hero, not the invincible soldier, but the human being beneath the uniform. Hollywood took notice. In 1955, To Hell and Back was turned into a film, and Murphy played himself. The movie became one of the most successful war films of its time, shattering box office records. But filming it was agony for him. Reenacting the battles, seeing the explosions, hearing the gunfire, it tore open old scars. He once said after a scene, "Those aren't just stunts to me. I've lived every one of them." The director would sometimes find him shaking between takes, lost in memories of men who never came home. As the years went on, Murphy tried to live the life of a celebrity, but the darkness followed him everywhere. He acted in westerns, appeared on magazine covers, and attended public events, but inside, he was fighting a war that never ended. He carried a pistol with him everywhere, even while sleeping, afraid of unseen enemies. He avoided crowds and spent long nights staring at the ceiling, haunted by the ghosts of the fallen. He told friends that he felt bold inside, even though he was barely in his 30s. The military had taught him how to fight, but not how to stop fighting. His fame became a burden, his medals a reminder of all he'd lost. The people saw the legend, the soldier who faced 250 Germans alone. But what they didn't see was the man behind the legend, the one who couldn't close his eyes without hearing the screams of his friends. In interviews, he often said that the hardest battle he ever fought was the one after the war. "You can't escape the memories," he once told a reporter. "They come back when you least expect it, when it's quiet, when you're alone." And Murphy was alone often. His marriage suffered. His finances crumbled. Hollywood moved on to younger faces. By the 1960s, the once celebrated war hero was struggling with depression, insomnia, and addiction to sleeping pills. He became a recluse, avoiding the spotlight that had once celebrated him. Yet, even in his struggle, there was dignity. Murphy used his voice to speak for others who shared his invisible wounds. He advocated for veterans' mental health, long before PTSD was recognized or understood. He testified before Congress, urging better treatment for soldiers returning from Vietnam. He said, "The real heroes are the ones who have to live with what they saw." He knew what it meant to carry that burden, and he refused to let others face it alone. Murphy's story wasn't just one of glory, it was one of survival. The boy who grew up hungry in Texas had become a symbol of courage. The soldier who stood alone in France became the voice for those who couldn't speak. And through his pain, he reminded the world that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It lives on in the hearts of those who fought it. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy's journey came to an end in a tragic plane crash in Virginia. He was 45 years old. The news spread quickly across America. Flags were lowered, veterans wept, and newspapers once again printed his photograph, that familiar face, youthful yet weathered, with eyes that had seen too much. At his funeral in Arlington National Cemetery, thousands gathered to pay their respects. Soldiers, families, politicians, all came to honor the man who had carried the weight of an army on his shoulders. As the bugler played taps and the folded flag was handed to his widow, silence fell across the crowd. It was the same kind of silence that had followed Murphy all his life, the silence of respect, of sorrow, of remembrance. The inscription on his grave was simple, understated, just his name, rank, and honors. No mention of fame or film. Just the truth, Audie L. Murphy, Medal of Honor recipient. But his legacy didn't end there. Across generations, soldiers would study his actions at Holtzwihr, reading about the day a single man stood against hundreds and refused to yield. Military academies analyzed his tactics. Historians debated his psychology. And filmmakers continued to draw inspiration from his life. Yet, for all the analysis and myth-making, the essence of his story remained pure and human, the story of a young man who, when everything collapsed around him, chose to stand his ground. Even the German veterans who had fought near Holtzwihr spoke of him with respect. Some said they believed they had faced a machine gun nest, not a single soldier. They could not fathom one man wielding so much power, so much defiance. In their eyes, Audie Murphy represented something rare, an enemy they could fear and admire in equal measure. And that is perhaps the greatest testament to his legacy. True courage transcends nationality, ideology, and time. It speaks a language that every soldier understands, the will to stand, the refusal to surrender, the fire of humanity that burns even in the darkest hours of war. Today, when people visit his grave, they don't just see the medals or the dates. They see the story, a story written not in ink, but in courage. A story that says, one person can make a difference, even when the world stands against them. A story that proves that bravery is not born on the battlefield, it is born in the heart, forged in hardship, and tested in fire. For Audie Murphy, that fire never truly went out. It burned in his eyes on the battlefield, in his words as an author, and in his quiet advocacy for those who carried invisible scars. His life reminds us that heroes are not perfect, they are simply those who rise when others fall, who keep going when everything inside them says stop. And though decades have passed, the image of that small Texan soldier standing on a burning tank, surrounded by snow and smoke, still echoes through history. Because in that frozen moment in 1945, Audie Murphy didn't just fight for his men, he fought for the very idea of courage itself.